So that deep dive into some of the terms of the law as it's likely to shape up, I think, are really important. I'm going to zoom back out and think about some of the more strategic issues for unions in particular, because I think there are some real opportunities in this bill. And I think my view of the law, I'm an employment relations specialist rather than an employment rights specialist. I'm interested in how the collective regulation of work works. And in that context, law is an important signal of the mood music. It's very important in specific cases, but it's the change of the context and the change of the messages that we get about legitimacy and about whose voices can be represented that's probably the most important day-to-day aspect of changing law. I've had terrible time with politicians and civil servants trying to explain to them why granting employment rights doesn't necessarily change the employment relations context, and that a lot of the enforcement and the signalling of how rights are developed and enforced is actually by far the most important thing for many workers on a day-to-day basis. So there are four main messages that I want to convey in my talk today. I'll try and keep us to time. So I'll go through some of the bits slightly quicker than I would have done. The first is that the bill needs to be seen as a package. The intention of the legislators in this process is that this is a suite of rights that should intersect, and I'll give some examples in a moment about how that might happen. The second is that there will be additional demands on time and resource, both of unions and employers. The unions are the bit that this room is interested in, particularly with the enforcement of these new rights, particularly things like extending time that workers can raise cases, etc., in cases for employment tribunal, things like that. But there are likely to be some significant opportunities, and I think we probably haven't spent enough time individually within our unions, but also collectively thinking about where those opportunities are. And we need to think, therefore, quite strategically. I think there's going to be some opportunities where at least some unions, I think probably most unions, are going to have some resources saved as a result of these rights. And I think we then need to think strategically about how we prioritise the use of those resources. And then we need to centre how this package of changed rights presents organising opportunities in different unions, different sectors, different occupational groups. So I think those are the four messages. And I think my messaging is slightly different from some of my academic colleagues who've been really quite negative about some of the approach of this bill. And I'll hope to explain to you why in the next 15 minutes or so. So I think there is a change of mood music with this and this bill, and I think it's that change of mood music about who is legitimately representing workers' interests and how the collective regulation of work and employment should work that really matters. The provisions are important, but it's that change of context that I think is most important. So I think it's quite useful to break the bill down into changes of individual rights, changes of collective rights, and changes of institutional rights. And like Paul Novak, and perhaps unsurprisingly, given the work that Paul and I have done over the years, I also think it's the change of the institutional rights that is actually the biggest signal and the one that we all need to attend to, whether or not they directly affect the unions and the occupational groups that we represent. So I won't go through the big detail of these clauses. Again, even on these slides, this is not it's not a comprehensive summary of these bills, but there are strengthening individual rights, of which I personally think the most radical is statutory sick pay. I really think we've kind of collectively ignored how radical the extension of statutory sick pay is. And how many workers it will affect. 1.4 million workers will be brought into SSP almost overnight. And I think that really matters, and I think we need to applaud ourselves and congratulate ourselves for that. But there's a suite of other individual rights. I also think we need to explain these rights to workers as well, and I'll come to that point again in a minute. There's a set of collective rights, and I've selected, some of them affect particular sectors. Maritime workers are particularly picked out as an occupational group for further regulation. But there's things like strengthening collective redundancy rights, changes to fire and rehire, these kinds of things. So that's a set of rights that affect workers when they're, that affect workers collectively. But then there's a set of institutional regulations, and I think these are really where the bill is more than just signalling that workers have a different set of rights. Fair pay agreement in adult social care, I'll talk about specifically in a minute. This is a clear signal from the government that it is legitimate. Tripartite regulation of a sector, of an occupational sector, is legitimate, it can be organised, and it is supported from the highest levels of government. Now, there's lots of problems that go with that, but it's an important message that's going out. It affects us all, even if we don't work in adult social care, because it's sending a signal that it is legitimate to regulate work and employment at sectoral level. So I won't go over the recognition legislation. I think that's been done very well in the session just before. And I think we all know and agree that the enforcement rights are really important. It's a point that I've consistently made to all stakeholders. It's one thing to give rights, it's another thing to make sure they can be enforced collectively. I think there's still work to do in that space. We're going to be building institutions that enforce collective regulation for really quite a long time. This is not an overnight fix, but there are some good things in this bill. So when I say these new rights interact, what do I mean? So if we take the example of an ununionised precarious hospitality worker, they're going to be benefiting from a number of these changes. In fairly sort of simplistic high-level summary, they'll see some improvements to their statutory sick pay. They're probably excluded from SSP at the moment. They'll almost certainly be covered by the rights on small hours contracts. I think we have to move away from the language of 0 hours contracts. This is not just regulating 0 hours contracts. But there are also rights in there that strengthen harassment rights or anti-harassment rights. And I think that this is a sector where we know that is rife. We're going to be able to use this as an organising conversation with these workers in some really interesting ways. They will benefit from individual rights, such as right to leave for parental responsibilities, bereavement, and there's also some specific legislation about consulting on how tips are distributed. So these imaginary hospitality workers, they're going over the next couple of years to see a change in the context in which they work. And we have a responsibility to explain to them that has been won by us, essentially. We're going to have an opportunity to have organising conversations with these workers, with all the difficult sectoral patterns of organising these workers, but their work is going to get better, very likely going to get better as a result of a lot of the terms of this bill. When we look at these institutional rights, there's a third area of rights. I think the fair pay agreement in the care sector is a really important signal. So I come from Scotland specifically, we're talking about England here, but there are specific Scottish things going on. I think it's important that we understand that this isn't free collective bargaining as the ILO would recognise it. This is more akin to a wages board. The minister still has really quite a lot of say over what is negotiated and how it's signed off. But it's not just about pay. It's a slight misnomer in its title. What it essentially is, it's an instruction to social partners to bargain a framework agreement, and so to establish some collective norms for that occupational group. There is some money announced. I think that will help focus minds. It's not going to be enough. I think everyone knows that. But it will focus minds on exactly how that money is distributed. And I really think here time is of the essence. We need to get something off the ground. In New Zealand, they passed some very similar legislation, which actually, they made good progress towards implementing it. A change of government then cut the legs from under it. So I think it's really important that we get this off the ground as a starting point, even though it's not everything that we want. And the comparison I use is with the national minimum wage, and how disappointed a lot of us were at the low level of the national minimum wage at the outset, but how that has become an incredibly effective, we've basically now regulated out of existence very low pay as defined by international standards in this country as a result of starting with a relatively modest starting point and then building it up. So there are a lot of questions. I am giving quite very deep thought to these questions at the moment. I'm quite happy to go into them in detail in any conversations with people around the room. But who are the social partners? There are some really key questions about who is negotiating, particularly in a sector where commissioning and employers are sometimes the same people. How do you coordinate employers? I think this is the big, big question. How do you get such a diverse group of people into a room with a single set of demands ready to negotiate? Unions can do that on the employee side. We're actually very good at that. But doing that with employers in the completely individualized UK industrial relations landscape that we currently have is a thorny question, and but it's not impossible to crack. Many of us have spent a lot of time in many countries building up effective employers associations. There is literally an ILO handbook about how to do this, but a commitment to doing it is really important. I think 500 million is a pretty good incentive for employers to think about that. We need to define the workforce. We need to account for devolution, that these are being dealt with in very different ways in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And the consultation timeline is currently underway. So I think one of the points that's come out today is there are already consultations out in relation to some of these issues. So many of you will have vested interest in returning, or your unions or your representative organisations will be submitting consultation responses on these things. And there's some detailed thinking that's happened around this. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but the point is, why should we all care about this kind of thing? Because this is just for adult social care in England. It is a clear signal for the support of social dialogue to determine wages and other terms and conditions. Now, that is a step change in the messaging that we've had about the legitimacy of collective regulation for many, many, many years. And I think it's really important that we process, all of us, that this is giving a legitimacy to what we do, whereas we've been fighting a tide for a very long time. What it further does, because many countries have forms of social dialogue that don't include trade unions or don't specifically privilege trade unions, this actually does. It gives a very specific role for trade unions to be the voice of workers. And that's not taken for granted. So we need to really take that and work out what we do with that. So legitimizing the role of unions is a really important change in the language in England. In Scotland, we've been comfortable in this space for quite a long time, but there is a commitment to extending this to other sectors that are difficult to organise. So I think the real lesson, my real worry, is if we can't land this, then the opportunity for collective sectoral regulation is off the agenda, probably for the rest of my working life, and probably for the rest of many of you. And it will be used by political enemies, if it fails, as an example of why you can't regulate at sectoral level. Sectoral level regulation is by far the most effective way of redistributing wages and wealth that anyone has ever invented. So we need to make this work, and we need to make it work collectively. And the unions that are in the room, which is by far not everyone who's in the room here today, will need the support of many of us collectively and individually. So all of this brings new rights and enforcement is obviously a key issue. That is going to bring challenges to unions. It is going to require some additional resources. We're anticipating an uptick of individual cases and collective cases as workers get these new rights. That's going to bring some costs to our unions. But it also brings real opportunities for organising conversations about how central unions have been to winning some of these rights and then enforcing some of these rights. So these narrative opportunities affect all of us. And I think we really need to be gearing up to really frame this as a win that we have fought for. There are also some potential resource opportunities. So changes, for example, to electronic balloting, for those of us in unions who ballot a lot, is going to actually free up some resource. It's going to take down that cost of balloting very significantly. Now, that's going to free up both activist time and union time, and probably some money too. So I'm really keen that we start to think strategically about what our priorities are, because it's very easy as that time gets liberated to think, oh, well, it'll just go into something else, but without thinking about that in quite a strategic way. So I think different unions have different kind of patterns of balloting, for example, or different issues with workplace access. So what that looks like in your union will be different from what it looks like in UCU. Trust me, we will save a lot of money. But it's important that we think strategically then about where we want to direct that time and resource. And I'm not sure that I'm hearing at the moment a huge amount of that strategic thinking. Just finally, I think there are organising opportunities as well. So access to workers, as we've heard, I think this is quite a game changer, potentially, even with some of the questions that are unclear at the moment. And simplified statutory recognition might also provide significant organising opportunities. Mandatory information about unions is also going to give us space to have some of these conversations. But for me, this is all about the narratives. This is all about how we then use all of this to talk to workers about what we do, why they should join us, why they should get active, why they should come along into a collective in their union. So I think the organising opportunities are really quite significant. So some concluding thoughts. We always want more. That's what we do. Trade unions always want more. That's quite natural. But there is a lot to like in this bill, and I'm really keen to be a counter to some of those more negative voices. Yes, there's a lot of stuff that's not clear. It's a big change, but there are real opportunities. Individual and collective rights are important, and I don't want anyone to take anything that I've said as minimising the importance of those individual and collective rights. But rebuilding the institutional regulation of work is a game changer in the UK. We are so far behind our comparator countries in this regard. We won't get everything right. There will be lessons. And I think it's really important that we try not to tear ourselves apart about that. I know where the tendencies are, and we really need to try and collectively make this work so that we can then move into a new era, hopefully, of collective regulation. So changing laws is the first step, but the real work starts now and with the people in this room. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Mel.